Victor unexpectedly arrives in Denver to visit his daughter Alondra and granddaughter Sophia, carrying a warm memory. On Christmas Eve, he finds Sophia shivering on the porch, with purple lips and red eyes. His heart breaks. Without thinking, he picks her up, holds her cold, pale body, and runs to a taxi. On the way to the hospital, Sophia faints. That night changes her life. I took a taxi and, as I drove through the streets decorated with lights and families, to midnight mass, I remembered the years when Alondra would happily jump beside me and ask me to tell her a fairy tale, but something was bothering me. All day I tried to call her, but she didn't answer. I convinced myself she would be busy cooking dinner with her husband's family. When Mateo arrived home, the night's cold shook me to the core. I slowly went to the window and looked outside. Inside, turkey, apple salad, and glasses of wine were set on the table. The Beltran family, Mateo's parents, his sister, and children, were happily toasting in front of the fireplace. But I couldn't see Sophia. I frowned, searching for her. Then I heard a sound, a faint moan, almost lost in the night air. My heart stopped. I turned to the porch, and there was Sophia, slumped in a wooden chair, wearing only a thin blouse, her lips purple and eyes red. Sophia fainted in my arms on the way to the hospital. For a moment, panic overwhelmed me, but my mind immediately focused on one thing. I picked up my granddaughter, rushed out the emergency room door, and screamed for help. The doctors confirmed what my heart already knew. Sophia was suffering from hypothermia and severe dehydration. As they treated her, my anger consumed me. How did they get to this point? I felt like confronting them, screaming in their faces about what they'd done, but I swallowed the lump in my throat and held my granddaughter's hand. I never let my daughter and my granddaughter go through something like that again. When Sophia woke up, her voice trembled with cold and fear. She hugged me with all her might. "Grandma," she whispered through tears. Dad beat Mom and locked her in the basement and complained. My heart stopped. I asked her if it was true. She looked at me with her big, sad eyes and shook her head. "We've been silent for a while," she confessed. "And Mom is pregnant." This news felt like a punch to the gut. Sophia told me what had happened that night. I asked my dad for permission to go with my friends, who invited me over for bagels and hot chocolate, she said, and left me outside on the porch, saying if I moved, he would do something to my mother and the baby. The brutality was so unimaginable that my breath stopped. A lump of helplessness and anger froze in my throat. I realized that their silence wasn't due to indifference, but fear. It was that fear that had made me make a silent promise to my granddaughter. I wouldn't let anyone harm her again. But revenge is cold, and I'm a master of patience. I knew I wouldn't be able to face them right then. The doctors were busy treating my granddaughter, and I was silently planning my next move. My patience is my greatest weapon. I swallowed the lump in my throat and held my granddaughter's hand. I wouldn't let my daughter and granddaughter endure something like this again. My next stop was the Beltran family's home. And this time, it wasn't a surprise visit. I had to confront my son-in-law's family and expose the cruelty I'd witnessed. But before I go any further, tell me which country you're hearing my story from. I want to know. 2 days later, when Sophia was discharged from the hospital and the doctors advised her to take care of her health, I took her to a hotel with me. My priority was to keep her safe. My granddaughter was no longer shivering from the cold, but the fear in her eyes was still there. On the way, I hugged her tighter than ever and promised her that everything would be different from now on. I would never let the darkness that had surrounded her touch her again. My patience is my greatest weapon. Without any prior notice, I headed towards the house I had given my daughter. When I arrived, the door was open. I saw the Beltran family sitting in the living room as if nothing had happened. Mateo had his feet on the table, and her father, Mr. Beltran, was reclining on the sofa with a drink in his hand. The contrast was unbearable. Inside was a scene of peace and prosperity, while outside my granddaughter was shivering and her stomach was empty. And there, in the far corner, stood Londra, my daughter, wearing a loose dress that tried to hide the shape of her pregnant belly, had a deep weariness in her gaze. There was a silence that completely gripped her. She glanced at me, but immediately lowered her gaze. There was so much fear in her eyes that I realized she was not only afraid of her husband, but also resigned to her fate. However, Sophia held my hand tightly and squeezed it tightly, confirming her words. Mom and I will be your witnesses. Anger boiled inside me. No one stood up, no one asked about Sophia. They just looked at us with indifference and contempt, as if we were intruders. Teresa, Mateo's mother, holding a glass and a fake smile, asked sweetly, "Oh, Donna Elena, what a surprise. What are you doing here?" I looked her straight in the eyes. "If you and your family had done the right thing, I probably wouldn't be here," I replied firmly. "But I certainly wouldn't be. There's no decency in this house." I felt everyone's anger at my reaction. Mateo stood up arrogantly, his face red with alcohol. "You have no right to come to my house and make a scene. I gave you permission to take the girl. What more do you want?" I stood there, staring at him. His pride was so great that he had no idea what trap he had fallen into. I took a folder of documents from my bag, took a piece of paper, and thrust it forward, showing them what it was. "You're leaving my house now," I shouted, firm and clear. "That's my name. Are you leaving now, or should I call the police?" The laughter suddenly stopped. Silence fell. Mateo's face contorted into a mixture of anger and panic. Mr. and Mrs. Beltran looked at each other in disbelief. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. I stared at them all, anger boiling inside me. "Are you really not going to throw my son out of the house?" Teresa asked in disbelief. Her voice was no longer sweet, but filled with venom. "This is my daughter's house, not your son's. And he's just a tenant," I replied without hesitation. Mr. Beltran, the head, stood up, defeated. Okay, we'll leave," he said in a deep voice, filled with a strong rage for revenge. "But there will be consequences." "Consequences?" I asked with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You just have to face the consequences of your actions here." I put my hands in my pockets. My voice calmed a little, but the coldness of my words made them hesitate. Before I could say anything else, I said, "Think about it. Don't let your words push you to a point you think you'll never reach." They didn't know everything they said was being recorded. They would now feel the terror they had put my daughter and granddaughter through. And I, working on my plan, knew this was just the beginning. Mateo froze for a moment, anger and confusion evident on his face. "We're married," he said in a heavy voice. "Wherever you are, I'll be there." Without another word, he turned and went into his bedroom. Mr. and Mrs. Beltran exchanged a defeated look and left the house without hesitation. In the living room, the silence was broken by the front door closing. Alondra, who had been completely silent, tried to get up, but her body wouldn't respond. She could barely stammer. "Mom, please." I cautiously approached her and knelt down beside her. I caressed her belly, which she could no longer hide, and I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces. "Daughter, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever tell me I was pregnant?" Just then, Sophia came up to us, hugged my leg, and held her big. She started looking at me with pain-filled eyes. "We were scared, Grandma," she whispered. "He beats Mom very hard and ties her up. Sometimes he forces her to do things, even when she's pregnant. Mom is so scared, Grandma." Tears streamed down my cheeks. The brutality was so unimaginable that I was speechless. I looked at Londra, her head bowed and her body shaking. Her silence was the most painful evidence. After so much humiliation, she had given up. "Daughter," I said softly, "you don't have to be silent anymore. I'll speak for you. Sophia says she can testify. And you. I think that's what will happen." I looked her straight in the eyes, trying to ignite a spark of hope in her gaze. "Do you know what justice looks like, darling?" Victor's voice was filled with deep pain, but a tiny spark of hope flickered in his eyes. Sophia, his 7-year-old granddaughter, clung to his leg, her big, trusting eyes fixed on him. Her little face glowed with bravery and confidence, as if she were ready to tell the truth to her grandfather. At the police station, adrenaline was surging through me. I spoke to an officer and showed him my mobile phone with the recording. I told him everything I had seen and also offered my granddaughter's testimony. I told him that little Sophia could testify. And so could her mother. The officer, his face serious, listened attentively. As Sophia spoke, her voice was soft, but her words were powerful and powerful. In a hospital room in Denver, amid dim lighting and the smell of antiseptic, Sophia revealed the truth in her small, trembling voice. She described how her father, Matteo, had been cruel to her mother, Alondra, forcing her to work against her will and leaving her out in the cold as punishment. Each word was like a sharp dagger, piercing the heavy silence of the room. Hearing her daughter speak, Alondra, her own courage shattered, her eyes filled with regret and pain. She held Sophia's tiny hand, looked at me, and in a trembling but firm voice said, "I will testify too." With me, my daughter and granddaughter recounted the entire harrowing story. The officer charged Matteo with serious counts of domestic violence, child abuse, and mental abuse. Matteo's parents' silence branded them accomplices, their silence as culpable as Matteo's behavior. At trial, the hospital medical examination confirmed Sophia's hypothermia and dehydration, irrefutable, undeniable proof of negligence and cruelty. And with my daughter's testimony, forensic doctors were able to document the marks of recent beatings on her body, evidence of the physical and emotional abuse she had endured for months. The trial proceeded swiftly, filled with irrefutable evidence. The recordings, the girls' and my daughter's testimony, and the medical evidence left the Beltran family with no recourse. The judge delivered his verdict. Matteo was sentenced to several years in prison for domestic violence and child abuse. Matteo's parents were also found guilty of involvement and were also sentenced to prison. Over time, my daughter recovered not only physically but emotionally as well and gave birth to a beautiful baby boy in a loving home. And I, now just a grandmother, thanked life for giving me courage that Christmas night when I prayed for her and promised her she would never be alone again.